And just a reminder that the May issue of the BBC Wildlife magazine is now available.
Live from Lausanne in Switzerland, artists from 22 countries compete in one of Europe's most popular music events. Terry Wogan takes us through the 34th Eurovision Song Contest with this year's British entry, Roy Caruana and live report, hoping to hit the right note with the judges. The Eurovision Song Contest, Saturday, 8 o'clock on BBC1.
Well, because the snooker final's already finished, BBC Two's evening has been rescheduled. And just starting is the BAFTA award-winning BBC production of Hotel du Lac, with an all-star cast including Denham Elliott and Anna Massey. Here on BBC One, we come to our special feature film for Bank Holiday Monday. It's the first showing on British television of Star Trek III, The Search for Spock. And the film starting very shortly over on BBC Two is Woody Allen's famous comedy Annie Hall, which won 4 Oscars, including Best Actress for Diane Keaton as the beautiful but neurotic Annie.
Beginning tomorrow on BBC One.
Stop talking about her!
He was old enough to be her father.
Anybody think they're having an affair the way we're carrying on?
She wanted a father for a child she wasn't allowed.
It ruins everything.
How can you think like that?
It's an accident. It's a mistake.
A baby!
Someone else in our house.
2 people brought together in a moment of crisis, unaware that the real crisis was about to begin.
Just don't always expect me to be in control!
Starring Annette Crosby, Rhys Dinsdale, Maggie O'Neill and Keith Barron in Take Me Home, beginning tomorrow at 9:35 on BBC One.
In 15 minutes, Sheena Easton makes the first of her guest appearances with Crockett and Tubbs in Miami Vice. Now on BBC One at 10:10, the main news with Phillip Hayton.
A riot at Risley Remand Centre in Cheshire has caused extensive damage and forced the evacuation of 250 inmates. Tonight, 30 prisoners are still on the roof after attacking warders and wrecking cells. And victims talk about the shootings on Tyneside as police charge a civil servant with murder. Good evening. 250 prisoners have been moved from Risley Remand Centre in Cheshire following more than 24 hours of protests by inmates. Tonight, prison officers have regained control of one wing, but a rooftop protest at another is continuing. Around 100 prisoners have been involved in the protests at Risley. The Prison Officers Association said inmates had wrecked one wing in what they called an orgy of destruction.
The protests first became visible about lunchtime when a number of prisoners climbed out onto the roof of D Wing. This was a demonstration against the authorities' decision to ban visits for the day, taken in the light of the disruption continuing out of sight in B Wing, where as many as 70 others were barricaded inside one floor of the building. As reinforcements arrived, complete with riot control equipment, it became clear that a serious disturbance had taken place. Later it was confirmed that 2 officers had sustained broken fingers, 1 other had cracked ribs. The authorities said that none of the prisoners had been hurt. They, meanwhile, tried to damage parts of the roof and hurled missiles into the yard below. One of them even had a riot shield. Some inmates were transferred away from Risley, which has been the scene of rooftop protests before. The authorities say that the prisoners are voicing familiar complaints.
The usual concerns have been expressed about conditions, being locked up, food. This is normal in this kind of circumstance.
Banners appeared during the afternoon as more joined the protest. Beneath them, 2 sections of Risley had been extensively damaged. No hostages were taken, but a member of the Prison Officers Association said that 2 of his colleagues only just escaped capture. The wardens had locked themselves in a cell for protection. As prisoners tried to break the door down, the 2 men were rescued by officers who managed to knock a hole through an outside wall and drag them to safety. The local Prison Officers Association highlighted that incident as the most dangerous in what it described as an orgy of destruction.
It's a situation which we long felt would happen. We are in the game again of saying to the prison department, we told you so. And I wish to make this a matter of public record at this time. We are no longer going to tolerate having again to say, we told you so.
Dusk came, the protesters on the roof of D Wing stayed, though the barricaded protest in B Wing is over. What remains is the ongoing concern about the crisis in the prison service.
Risley was built as a showpiece remand centre in 1965, but within weeks the first prisoner had committed suicide. Designed to hold 500 inmates, at times the population has been almost double, putting pressure on staff and prisoners alike. At the moment there are 600 men and 140 women on remand there. In a scathing report last July, the Chief Inspector of Prisons, Judge Stephen Tumim, condemned conditions at Risley as barbarous and squalid. Prisoners' groups welcomed his report as a devastating indictment of the centre, and they say very little has been done since to improve matters.
Something should have been done to ensure that they were out of their cells for most of the day. They really ought to be entitled to activities, to education, to work if they want to, and just to a regime which doesn't keep them behind the cell door for 20 or 23 hours.
The prison officers say the key problem is undermanning, and Risley isn't alone.
It has to be recognised that the service has to be properly resourced and that law and order does not finish at the prison gate. If this continues, we're very, very much afraid that we will see a loss of life.
Since last year's report, there have been 2 more suicides and several rooftop demonstrations. But the Home Office say a £2.5 million refurbishment programme is already underway, and the centre will be completely rebuilt over the next 6 years.
A 22-year-old man has been charged with murder following yesterday's shooting in Tyneside. Robert Sartin, a civil servant, will appear before magistrates in North Shields tomorrow morning. 1 man died and 14 people were injured in the shootings at Monk Seaton near Whitley Bay. 4 people are still in hospital. Some of the victims have been talking about their experiences.
These quiet suburban streets, anonymous until yesterday, still show the scars. Many in Monk Seaton tried to live on as on a normal May bank holiday. But Bob Wilson is one of nearly a dozen neighbours and friends now out of hospital bearing his wounds. The suddenness of the attack, which left him covered with shotgun pellets, has still not quite sunk in.
I knew I'd been hit with something. I didn't realise at that time what. I knew my face was bleeding quite heavily. And my first reaction was I'd been shot and blown off my face off. I realised very quickly, once I saw myself in the mirror, I hadn't. So I wiped the blood up as best I could and came back out.
As soon as I realised I'd been shot, I said, mustn't I been shot? And I just ran into the garage and into the back. You know, it's just unbelievable. You see it happening in films, but you don't, visualise it happening to yourself.
The local MP came to call while the police were continuing their inquiries. He said people should be banned altogether from keeping guns in the community.
I'm going to say to the Home Secretary that there clearly has to be a further look into the whole question of the licensing of firearms and their custody. And the action that has been taken, obviously, self-evidently, has not been enough.
Since the Hungerford massacre, automatic rifles like the one used by Michael Ryan have been outlawed. Pump-action shotguns are harder to own, but an unlimited number of ordinary shotguns can still be held on a single licence. For now, there's close attention on events in Monk Seaton, but despite growing pressure for tighter controls, the government has signalled that there'll be no more changes in the gun laws. Today, Home Office Minister Douglas Hogg described the changes already made since Hungerford as very substantial.
The Foreign Office are protesting to Czechoslovakia over the arrest of a British journalist during today's May Day celebrations in Prague. Czech riot police cleared the city centre after demonstrators started chanting "Freedom, freedom" and "Gorbachev is watching you." Dozens of protesters were arrested. The journalist, Misha Glenny of the BBC World Service, was punched in the face and held by secret police for 5 hours. In Turkey, there was worse violence. More than 30 demonstrators were injured as they tried to march through Istanbul in defiance of a ban on May Day protests. They threw stones, the police charged, then opened fire. In contrast, Moscow's May Day celebrations were relaxed and colourful. 150,000 people forgot more pressing problems as they enjoyed the annual parade in spring sunshine through Red Square.
It's the high holiday of the workers' state, an official rededication of loyalty to the revolution and a chance for its leaders to enjoy the unclouded admiration of the masses. But while the marchers maintain their obligatory gaiety, this year's May Day comes at a time of doubt and change in socialist values. Popular dissatisfaction has produced a new brand of radical politicians like Boris Yeltsin, chatting in the crowd about his concept of new political groupings. And the May Day weekend brought counter-demonstrations this year, a vigorous gathering of activists calling for greater freedom of expression that's bound to trouble the authorities. Mr. Gorbachev's young granddaughter, though, kept her enthusiasm for the parade. What could be in doubt is how the Soviet Union will be celebrating May Day and who'll be leading the celebrations when she reaches the age of political awareness. Martin Sixsmith, BBC News, Moscow.
In South Africa, a leading civil rights activist has been shot dead by a masked gunman outside his home in Johannesburg. David Webster, a 44-year-old university lecturer, had campaigned against the government policy of detention without trial. Colleagues say the killing was politically motivated. The Law Society has strongly criticised the Lord Chancellor's plans for the legal profession. The Society, which represents solicitors in England and Wales, said they added up to a dangerous accumulation of power in the hands of a government minister.
After spending 3 months discussing the government's proposals, the solicitors called a rare bank holiday news conference to stress their concern. They're particularly worried that lawyers may end up being controlled by the government. They say that would be the effect of a new advisory committee planned by Lord Mackay.
His proposal with his committee is that his advisory committee should be staffed by his men. It should be manned by his appointees. They should advise him, and his own staff would give him advice.
And that would have dangers?
Well, it must have dangers, we think, because that gives ministerial control of independent professions.
The solicitors are also worried that they'll lose their conveyancing monopoly. Lord Mackay wants to allow banks, building societies and estate agents to do the legal work for their customers. But the Green Paper has some good news for solicitors. They'd be allowed to speak in the higher courts for the first time, just like barristers. The solicitors say their response is aimed at protecting their clients' interests. Critics say they're just defending their own interests. Lord Mackay plans to announce his legislation by the end of July.
With 4 days to go to the Vale of Glamorgan by-election, Labour is flooding the South Wales constituency with campaign workers. In a poll published this morning, their candidate was 11 points clear. But the Conservatives say they can still win and won't change the nature of their campaign.
For 40 years, Conservative strength in the rural Vale has been more than a match for Labour's clout in the industrial town of Barry. But the latest taste of public opinion shows the Tories are struggling, though their candidate, Rod Richards, insists he's not downhearted.
The Labour support at by-elections is always overestimated by opinion polls. It was certainly overestimated in Pontypridd by some 10%.
Labour's John Smith is encouraged by evidence that traditional Tory areas are now less hostile to his brand of socialism.
We would have called that bandit country in the old days. We'd have said that's not for us. But now, when you go into a place like St George's and you see so many Labour posters, I mean, that's got to be first time since 1945, never.
The voters' apparent readiness to swap Conservative for Labour provides John Smith with his main sales pitch.
And I want you Conservatives who are confused and don't know what to do this Thursday, I want you to vote Labour, to make the right decision and vote for common sense this Thursday.
And there may only be a handful of votes in it, so your vote could be crucial.
Yes, well, you never know. Somebody's vote's going to be crucial.
What about the family? Are they going to vote for you as well?
I'm not quite so sure.
Labour have been scoring on water privatisation and the health service. Mr Richards points to thousands of jobs brought to Wales by his party. He says he can still win, though local bookies now have Labour odds-on to snatch the seat. The other parties, Plaid Cymru, the Old Alliance partners, the Democrats and the SDP, all look set to lose their deposits. Labour have taken just 2 seats from the Tories at by-elections since Mrs Thatcher came to power. Local Conservatives are now desperately anxious to avoid seeing the Vale of Glamorgan become the third this Thursday. It would, after all, rather spoil the Prime Minister's celebration of a decade in office.
There are 9 other candidates: Frank Levers, Keith Davis, John Dixon, Marilyn Wakefield, Dr. John T. Arks, Eric Roberts, Lord David Such, David Black and Lindy St. Clair. Now sport. And Arsenal have taken a 6-point lead over Liverpool at the top of the First Division after a comprehensive victory over Norwich at Highbury. Alan Smith scored twice in the 5-0 win. But Liverpool still have 2 games in hand. In the Second Division, the champions Chelsea won again, but Manchester City still can't be sure of promotion after drawing with Crystal Palace. Wolves have clinched promotion from the Third Division because Port Vale lost tonight. And Maidstone United, the club without a ground of their own, have won promotion to the 4th Division as champions of the Vauxhall Conference. Steve Davis has won the World Professional Snooker Championship for the 3rd year in a row and for the 6th time in 9 years. He beat John Parrott by 18 frames to 3 and produced what he described as the best performance of his career.
It was the most one-sided final ever. The world champion was always at his immaculate best, though in truth he didn't need to be. His opponents giving an unfortunate new connotation to the phrase, as sick as a parrot.
Oh dear, oh dear.
Leading 13-3 overnight, Davis reeled off the 5 frames he needed, one after another.
John Parrott concedes the title of Embassy World Snooker Champion, 1989, and a hat-trick goes to the fabulous Steve Davis.
Charismatic he may not be, the best snooker player in the world he undoubtedly is.
And that's all from the newsroom this May Day evening. Good night.